Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about a fungus. It's a story about what happens when the line between the natural world and human consciousness blurs and collapses. It's a story of fields and farmers, of poisoned bread and haunted villages, of hallucinations that reshaped laws, toppled communities, ignited superstition, and sent innocent people to their deaths. It is a story of madness real and imagined, carried on the smallest grain of rye. For centuries, ERGOT outbreaks devastated harvests, twisted bodies with convulsions, and pushed entire towns into spirals of panic. Some historians believe it fueled revolutions. Others argue it helped spark witch hunts. What we know for certain is that ERGOT quietly shaped human history in ways we are still uncovering. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy deep historical journeys like this one. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Phone away, distractions silenced. Let's begin. Our story begins in the quiet dawn of prehistoric agriculture, long before written records, in fields that now lie beneath layers of civilization. Imagine a landscape of early rye-hardy grain, prized by people living on cold, wind-swept plains where wheat would not grow. These early farmers tended their crops with simple tools and deep hope, unaware that another organism had already learned to thrive alongside them. A parasite, a shape-shifting fungus waiting for its moment. ERGOT, clinging to wild grasses, the fungus evolved long before humanity learned to sow seeds. It needed only moisture, shade, and a host plant. When the conditions aligned, slender purple sclerotia replaced the kernels of grain, hard, dark, and deadly. Prehistoric people had no language for the nightmares it caused, but archaeological evidence suggests they encountered its effects. Strange bone lesions found in early European graves hint at convulsive symptoms. Burnt offerings of spoiled grain point to rituals of fear and appeasement. We enter the first chapter of this story in the Fertile Arc, stretching across ancient Mesopotamia, around 8000 BCE, where some of the earliest domesticated rye varieties emerged. While wheat and barley dominated the agricultural landscape, rye survived in poorer soils. Farmers stored it, ground it, baked it, sometimes unknowingly, mixing ERGOT into their every meal. When entire communities shared the same harvest, the consequences spread rapidly, touching all ages and classes. Yet the connection between illness and grain remained invisible. The first documented clues appear much later. In the world of ancient Assyria, tablets inscribed with cuneiform symbols describe bewitched bread and cursed fields, suggesting outbreaks of strange illness linked to grain stores. People experienced burning sensations in their limbs, tremors, and terrifying visions. The Assyrians attributed these symptoms to divine punishment, or the influence of malevolent spirits lurking in the harvest. They feared the fields themselves, believing that mismanaged rituals or neglected offerings angered the gods of fertility. Meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, meticulous scribes recorded the health and agricultural practices of their civilization. Although Egypt's dry climate kept ERGOT outbreaks rare, some texts from the medical compendium known as the Ebers Papyrus describe illnesses with symptoms eerily similar to ERGOT poisoning, intense burning, gangrene, and delirium. Physicians of the time blamed curses or imbalances of bodily fluids. But modern scholars suspect that imported grains from wetter regions of the Nile Delta carried ERGOT into their granaries. As we move westward across time, the ancient Greek world offers one of the earliest clear windows into ERGOT's strange dual nature. While ERGOT tormented farmers and villagers, it also became an instrument of spiritual transcendence. On the slopes of Mount Parnassus, pilgrims traveled to the sanctuary of Eleusis, seeking enlightenment through a sacred drink known as kykeon. For centuries, the Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a revelation so profound that secrecy was enforced by law. Scholars now believe the kykeon may have been brewed using barley infected with ERGOT. The visions it produced were interpreted as divine encounters, messages from Demeter and Persephone. While uncontrolled ERGOT caused pain and madness, controlled ingestion may have offered ecstatic experiences that shaped spiritual thought for nearly 2 millennia. The first chapter of our history now shifts north into Iron Age Europe, where Celtic tribes cultivated rye extensively. Here, ERGOT found an ideal home. Cool, damp weather brought frequent outbreaks, and written accounts by Roman chroniclers describe barbarian tribes struck by limb rot and dancing madness. These descriptions align closely with what we now call gangrenous and convulsive ergotism. Without modern medical understanding, ancient peoples interpreted these symptoms as possession, curses, or divine wrath. But something changed as civilizations expanded, trade routes lengthened, and grain markets became more interconnected. The earliest broad European references to ERGOT appear around 600 BCE. But by the time of the Roman Empire, outbreaks were widespread enough to be recognized, even if not understood. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described noxious grains that caused burning sensations and madness. Though he never used the word ergot, his accounts leave little doubt as to what he observed. Our journey now enters early medieval Europe, where the church, monasteries, and rural farming communities all grappled with the mysteries of disease. Rye became a staple crop in regions where wheat struggled, especially across present-day France, Germany, and Eastern Europe. This increased reliance on rye meant entire populations were vulnerable to ergot contamination. When heavy spring rains saturated the fields and summers remained cool, the fungus flourished. The early records of monasteries from the 5th and 6th centuries describe outbreaks of what they called ignis sacer, holy fire. People felt as though flames licked at their limbs, skin blackened, hands and feet turned cold and brittle. Some victims claimed to see demons in the corner of their vision. Others reported the presence of angels or spectral figures guiding them toward death. Monks saw these visions as signs from heaven or hell, never suspecting that the cause lay in something as ordinary as bread. As pilgrimages increased across medieval Europe, outbreaks seemed to follow the routes of travelers. People fleeing famine or war carried their grain stores with them, inadvertently transporting ergot spores across regions and kingdoms. In the Rhine Valley, entire villages suffered convulsive episode seizures, twisting limbs and uncontrollable laughter. Chroniclers wrote that sufferers appeared possessed, moving with jerking precision as though controlled by strings. Many were ostracized or driven from their homes. In France, around the year 857, one of the earliest large-scale documented outbreaks occurred. Chronicles describe a great plague of swollen limbs that struck villages near the Rhine River. The symptoms align with gangrenous ergotism, where blood vessels constrict until limbs become necrotic. The afflicted lost fingers, toes, even entire limbs. For medieval physicians, this illness had no known cure. Many believed it a punishment for sin. As we move toward the close of Act 1, the story grows darker. Ergot outbreaks became so common in the early Middle Ages that entire religious orders formed around caring for the afflicted. Among the most famous were the Hospitallers of St. Anthony, founded in the 11th century. These monks treated victims with a combination of prayer, herbal remedies, and most importantly, clean, uncontaminated bread. Many patients recovered in their care, though the monks knew nothing of the fungus they were unknowingly avoiding. While these charitable orders battled the symptoms, the true cause of the disease remained a mystery, and as Europe entered the High Middle Ages, the conditions for even more devastating outbreaks were falling into place. Growing populations, expanding farmlands, new trade networks, climate shifts. But unseen within the fields, the purple sclerotia were multiplying, and the world would soon learn just how much destruction this fungus could unleash. But then, something changed. As Europe moved from the early medieval period into the High Middle Ages, ergot was no longer merely an unexplained rural affliction. It became a force that shaped economies, medicine, superstition, and the very structure of society. The world would never be the same after this period of transformation, when humanity began to record, classify, and question the disturbing outbreaks that haunted their fields and bakeries. The second chapter reveals the expanding footprint of ergot across medieval Europe. Grain became the backbone of everyday survival, and readaptable, hardy, cheap became the staple for millions. But with reliance came risk. Harvest failure, cold summers, and prolonged rains created perfect conditions for the fungus to thrive. By the 10th century, chroniclers documented outbreaks with chilling regularity. Many used the term ignis sacer, holy fire, because the pain felt by victims seemed to come from divine punishment rather than earthly cause. The transformation of understanding began slowly. In the 11th century, the Order of St. Anthony established a hospital at La Motte Saint-Didier in France, dedicated entirely to caring for victims of the burning sickness. Their methods incorporated fresh bread made from wheat, not rye, alongside prayers and rituals. Unbeknownst to them, the shift away from ergot-contaminated rye was the most effective treatment available. Their success drew thousands, seeking relief. The Antonine monks became famous healers, even as Europe remained blind to the true nature of the sickness. Moving into the 12th century, outbreaks intensified. Chroniclers in Germany described entire towns with citizens writhing in the streets, limbs convulsing uncontrollably. In 1129, a massive outbreak swept through France, leading to hundreds of amputations and deaths. Victims spoke of visions, demons mocking them from the rafters, angels whispering secrets, creatures crawling beneath the skin. These hallucinations fueled medieval fears of witchcraft, possession, and divine judgment. However, as monasteries began keeping more detailed medical notes, patterns emerged. Physicians observed that outbreaks coincided with poor harvests and damp summers. Something in the grain, they suspected, carried the curse. By the late 1200s, the first glimmers of scientific inquiry appeared. European scholars, influenced by translations of Arabic medical texts, began to investigate natural causes of disease. Though they lacked microscopes or chemical analysis, they recognized that environmental conditions affected health. A few chroniclers noted that only certain batches of bread produced the burning illness. Some physicians advised wealthier patients to avoid rye entirely when symptoms emerged in the countryside. In the 1340s, as the Black Death swept across Europe, fear of all forms of disease increased. Ergot outbreaks were sometimes mistaken for plague and vice versa, but careful observers noticed that ergot symptoms differed: blackened limbs, hallucinations, gangrene, and the infamous convulsions. Still, the lines between spiritual and physical explanations remained blurred. Scholars debated whether ergotism was a demonic trial or a natural affliction. The lack of consensus left millions vulnerable. As we progress into the Renaissance, a true transformation began. Europe embraced inquiry, experimentation, and the revival of classical learning. Physicians such as Paracelsus argued that illnesses had chemical causes, not spiritual ones. While he never identified ergot specifically, his writings encouraged investigation into toxins and environmental influences. This shift away from supernatural explanations paved the way for real scientific progress. By the 1500s, outbreaks were better documented than ever before. In 1596, a German physician named Adam Lonoceros published accounts of a strange grain that replaced kernels of rye and caused terrible disease when consumed. His observations, though incomplete, marked a crucial step toward identifying ergot as the source of the burning sickness. But ergot's impact extended far beyond medicine. It shaped culture, law, and belief. During the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, reports of mass hysteria and violent convulsions in rural villages were often interpreted through the lens of religious conflict. In France, during the Wars of Religion, outbreaks of convulsive ergotism were seen as signs of divine displeasure. Entire congregations fasted, prayed, and undertook public penance, not realizing that the cause lay in contaminated grain. In the world of agriculture, the transformation was equally profound. As European populations grew, demand for rye increased. Farmers pushed into marginal lands where moisture and shade gave the fungus ideal conditions to thrive. Grain traders often blended harvests from different regions, spreading contamination across borders. The rise of urban centers meant densely packed populations consuming bread from central mills. One contaminated batch could affect thousands. The interplay between economic growth and fungal outbreaks created cycles of disaster that shaped communities for centuries. But ergot also had another, stranger legacy. Its alkaloids, complex chemical compounds produced by the fungus, include substances that constrict blood vessels and trigger hallucinations. These properties would later fuel scientific breakthroughs, including the development of early pharmaceuticals. Yet in the Renaissance era, these effects were mysteries that blurred the line between illness and mysticism. By the 1600s, Europe saw its most notorious outbreaks. In 1630, a devastating epidemic hit Milan and surrounding regions. Hundreds suffered convulsions, gangrene, and hallucinations. Others blamed witchcraft, leading to accusations, trials, and executions. The role of ergot in shaping witch hunts remains a subject of debate, but historians note striking parallels between symptoms of ergotism and accounts of possession. This period saw one of the most chilling episodes: the events in Salem, Massachusetts. In 1692, although still debated, some scholars argue that ergot-contaminated rye may have contributed to the hallucinations and fits described during the witch trials. The Puritan colony faced damp summers, poor grain storage, and reliance on rye. Young girls experiencing convulsions and visions triggered a cascade of panic, accusations, and executions. Whether ergot was the cause remains unproven, but the theory underscores how deeply this fungus has intertwined itself with human fear and imagination. As we enter the 18th century, change accelerates. Scientific curiosity grows, and researchers begin cataloging natural phenomena with newfound rigor. In 1722, a French physician named Newel Chomel described the fungus known as ergot and noted its link to outbreaks of burning illness. His writings marked one of the most important turning points in the history of the disease. For the first time, a major medical authority recognized the correlation between the fungus on rye and the terrible symptoms afflicting rural populations. The Industrial Revolution brought new challenges and opportunities. Advances in milling technology meant grain was processed more rapidly, but contamination could spread farther through expanding distribution networks. At the same time, improvements in agricultural science offered new strategies for identifying and removing ergot. Yet outbreaks continued across Europe, especially during periods of war or famine, when people had no choice but to consume whatever grain they could find. In the late 1700s, another milestone came from a French physician named Tessier, who conducted controlled experiments on ergot. He fed contaminated grain to animals and documented their symptoms. confirming the link between the fungus and the disease. His research represented a monumental shift. Ergotism could no longer be dismissed as superstition or divine punishment. It was a natural illness with a natural cause. Still, the world was not yet ready for the full truth. As populations swelled and societies transformed, ergot continued to infiltrate the food supply. The next century would bring scientific discovery, medical advancement, and new horrors as wars and industrialization magnified its impact. Ergot had shaped ancient rituals, medieval suffering, and early modern superstition. But the shadow it cast over the 19th and 20th centuries would be darker still. What came next would shock the world. Because as Europe entered the 19th century, the story of ergot, once an intermittent curse tied to weather and harvest, evolved into a series of crises that tore through villages, nations, and empires. This was the period when ergotism became not just a medical condition, but a social catastrophe. Families fractured, policies failed, scientific breakthroughs collided with human tragedy. The third chapter of our journey begins in France in the early 1800s. The country was recovering from revolution and war, but rural communities faced new hardships. In 1816, the year without a summer swept across Europe after the eruption of Mount Tambora. Crops failed. Rye fields became damp breeding grounds for ergot. In the months that followed, outbreaks erupted across the French countryside. Physicians described twisted limbs, purple-black tissue, and hallucinations, so vivid that victims screamed through the night. In one village near Limoges, 24 people lost their hands or feet to gangrene in a span of weeks. The local priest wrote that it was as if the devil himself walked among the fields, while France struggled. Germany faced its own wave of convulsive ergotism. In 1853, in the region of Hesse, hundreds were struck by violent tremors. Hospitals filled with patients whose limbs jerked uncontrollably. Some spoke in broken, fragmented sentences, claiming to see spirits surrounding their beds. The medical reports preserved from this period are some of the most detailed accounts of ergotism ever recorded. One doctor wrote that patients acted as though puppeteered by an unseen force. Another noted that the hallucinations often carried religious themes, visions of angels, demons, or departed loved ones. But the most devastating outbreak of the 19th century took place in the Russian Empire. In 1862, along the Volga River, a massive famine pushed millions toward starvation. Grain stores were depleted. Villagers resorted to consuming spoiled, moldy, or partially ergotized rye, simply to survive. The consequences were staggering. Entire households collapsed under the weight of illness. Some villagers reported that their bread had a bitter taste and a strangely dark color, yet they ate it anyway, knowing the alternative was hunger. Russian physicians documented thousands of cases of both convulsive and gangrenous ergotism. In the town of Saratov alone, more than 3,000 people were hospitalized in one season. Government officials tried to intervene by importing wheat from other regions, but supply routes were slow and corruption was rampant. Many communities were left on their own, families buried, loved ones in frozen ground, often unsure whether disease or starvation had taken them. How did this happen, and why didn't anyone stop it? Those questions echo through the journals of the era, written by doctors who felt helpless in the face of suffering. As ergot outbreaks worsened, the scientific community intensified its efforts to understand the fungus. In 1853, a German botanist named Louis-René Toulon published groundbreaking work on the life cycle of ergot. He described how the fungus infected rye and produced the toxic sclerotia responsible for illness. For the first time, ergotism had a clearly documented biological cause. Yet this discovery did not immediately prevent outbreaks. In remote regions, awareness spread slowly. Farmers often ignored warnings, either out of disbelief or necessity. While science advanced, human tragedy continued. In Spain, in the late 1800s, a series of small outbreaks shook rural communities in Catalonia and Galicia. Local doctors blamed everything from contaminated water to curses. Only later did they realize that poorly stored rye was the culprit. The spread of ergot followed patterns of poverty, famine, and desperation, places where people had no choice but to consume whatever grain they could find. Across the Atlantic, ergot made a quieter but no less significant appearance in North America. Though conditions were less favorable for large-scale outbreaks, isolated cases occurred in farming communities in New England and Canada. Some historians connect these episodes to periods of mass hysteria, including strange behavior reported in rural towns during the early 19th century. The echoes of Salem lingered, reminding Americans how easily fear and illness could intertwine. But ergot's darkest consequences were not limited to rural communities. Its chemical properties fascinated chemists, who sought to extract useful compounds from the fungus. In 1918, researchers at Sandoz laboratories in Switzerland began isolating ergot alkaloids for medicinal use. These compounds could stimulate uterine contractions and constrict blood vessels, making them powerful tools in obstetrics and surgery, yet handling the fungus remained dangerous. Workers reported headaches, dizziness, and strange dreams after inhaling ergot dust. As the world approached the 20th century, the shadows of war cast new dangers. During World War I, crop shortages intensified reliance on rye in Eastern Europe. German medical officers documented dozens of cases of ergotism among soldiers on the Eastern Front, likely caused by contaminated bread supplies in occupied territories. These were not large outbreaks, but they demonstrated how war magnified every vulnerability in the food chain. The interwar years brought new scientific advances. Chemists learned to separate and categorize ergot alkaloids. Physicians used them to treat migraines, labor complications, and circulatory issues. However, rural outbreaks continued in poorer regions. In 1926, a severe epidemic struck the mountain villages of Romania. Dozens died. Survivors described nightmares so vivid that they refused to sleep, fearing the return of the visions. Local folklore absorbed these experiences, giving rise to tales of spirits haunting the hills and forests. Then came one of the most dramatic outbreaks in modern history. In 1951, in the quiet French village of Pont-Saint-Esprit, chaos erupted. Over 250 people fell suddenly ill. Some collapsed in the streets. Others clawed at their skin, convinced insects were crawling beneath it. One man leaped from a window, shouting that his body was on fire. Another attacked a neighbor he believed to be a demon. Hospitals overflowed. Some patients had to be restrained as they experienced powerful hallucinations. 5 people died. The cause was traced to contaminated rye flour used by a local bakery. Investigators discovered that the mill had stored grain in damp, poorly ventilated silos, perfect conditions for ergot growth. The events at Pont-Saint-Esprit became a case study in ergotism, cementing the fungus's reputation as both a medical danger and a psychological disruptor. Newspapers across Europe wrote about the cursed bread, reviving ancient fears in a modern world. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, smaller outbreaks continued throughout the 1950s and 1960s, especially in rural Kazakhstan and Siberia. Farmers reported unusual discoloration in their rye crops, but many ignored the signs due to shortages. Soviet medical journals documented dozens of cases of convulsive ergotism each year during this period. Government responses varied, sometimes effective, sometimes negligent, reflecting broader issues within the agricultural system. Globally, ergot became a symbol of how fragile food systems could be. In Ethiopia in the 1970s, famine conditions forced communities to consume contaminated barley. Outbreaks followed. Doctors working in rural clinics saw symptoms not recorded in Europe for decades. Some patients suffered from severe muscle spasms, others developed gangrene that spread rapidly. These cases underscored how closely ergotism was tied to poverty and food insecurity. While these medical crises unfolded, a quieter transformation occurred in laboratories. In 1938, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann synthesized a derivative of an ergot compound, lysergic acid diethylamide SD. Its psychedelic properties were discovered accidentally in 1943, sparking an entirely new cultural and scientific chapter. For some, LSD represented a doorway to altered consciousness. For others, it was a threat to societal order. Ergot had once again blurred the boundary between medicine, mystery, and madness. And yet, despite all the suffering it caused, ergot never disappeared. It simply adapted to changing agricultural landscapes. Modern farming reduced but did not eliminate its reach. In developing regions, especially where rye and barley remained dietary staples, outbreaks continued sporadically. Each one carried echoes of ancient fears and medieval horrors. By the close of the 20th century, ergot had left a trail of devastation across continents. Wars, famines, and economic upheaval had amplified its impact. Scientific advances had unveiled its biological secrets, but introduced new ethical dilemmas. And for millions, the fungus remained a shadow lurking at the edge of survival. As we leave this chapter of crisis, a new one begins. A chapter shaped by globalization, public health reforms, and the evolving relationship between humanity and its food systems. As we approach the modern age, the story shifts from catastrophe to control, but not without lingering consequences. As we approach the modern age, the landscape of ergot's influence begins to shift. The world of the 1960s through the 1990s was different from the centuries that came before, more connected, more scientific, more industrial. Yet ergot remained a silent presence in the global food chain, shaping medicine, policy, and agricultural practices across continents. Though its outbreaks became less frequent, its legacy deepened and its shadow lengthened into new realms of human experience. Our story enters this chapter with the rapid modernization of agriculture after World War II. Mechanized harvesting, improved seed selection, and chemical fungicides were gradually introduced across Europe and North America. These innovations dramatically reduced the likelihood of widespread ergot contamination. Farmers learned to identify the purple-black sclerotia and remove infected grain before milling. Inspectors patrolled grain markets with stricter standards. Food safety protocols grew more complex, more scientific. But while modern farming reduced ergotism in wealthier nations, it did not eliminate the fungus. In many developing regions, Africa, South Asia, parts of Eastern Europe, traditional farming methods remained dominant. Rye and barley continued to serve as staple crops, and grain storage often relied on wooden barns or earth huts vulnerable to moisture. In these regions, ergot outbreaks persisted in the late 20th century, though they were often underreported. Medical officers in Ethiopia, for example, documented dozens of severe cases in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly in areas affected by famine. Poor harvests weakened immunity, and contaminated grain blended into relief supplies. Victims described sensations of heat, burning, and visions that mirrored those written 700 years earlier in medieval chronicles. While some regions struggled with outbreaks, others explored ergot in scientific and commercial contexts. Pharmaceutical companies in Western Europe expanded research on ergot-derived drugs. In the 1960s, medications such as ergotamine became common treatments for migraines, harnessing the fungus's natural vasoconstrictive effects. Obstetricians used ergotamine to control postpartum bleeding, reducing maternal mortality rates worldwide. These successes reframed ergot from a medieval curse into a medical asset, proof that even the most dangerous organisms may hold extraordinary value. But this dual legacy also raised moral and cultural questions. How could something responsible for centuries of suffering become a tool of healing? And were there risks in relying on compounds born from such toxic origins? In the 1960s, ergot's chemical derivatives began influencing culture in ways no one had anticipated. Albert Hofmann's discovery of LSD, rooted in the molecular structure of ergot alkaloids, ignited a global conversation around consciousness, creativity, and psychological exploration. Researchers in the United States, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom studied LSD's potential in treating anxiety, depression, and addiction. Early reports from psychiatrists described breakthroughs in therapy. Patients claimed to access memories and emotions long buried. However, as the counterculture movement embraced psychedelics, governments responded with concern. By the early 1970s, LSD became a symbol of social unrest and political resistance. Nations across the world introduced strict regulations. What began as a laboratory curiosity spiraled into a worldwide cultural phenomenon. Ergot's influence had quietly entered literature, music, art, and political activism. The fungus that once sparked medieval visions had now inspired modern ones, shaping the imaginations of artists and thinkers. Yet, while the cultural conversation expanded, the older dangers of ergot remained deeply present in global agriculture. The 1980s saw several notable outbreaks in rural India, where sorghum and pearl millet, both susceptible to ergot-related fungi, formed part of the daily diet. In 1981, in the district of Karnataka, hundreds fell ill after consuming ergot-infected millet. Newspapers reported scenes reminiscent of European chronicles from centuries earlier. Villagers shaking violently, complaining of burning sensations in their limbs, and speaking of terrifying dreams. Indian health officials struggled to respond, lacking historical familiarity with ergot. Eventually, researchers identified the fungal contamination, and relief efforts focused on distributing clean grain. Elsewhere, in Eastern Europe, economic instability created openings for ergot to reappear. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, fragmented supply chains and reduced agricultural oversight resulted in contaminated grain entering local markets. Belarus and parts of Ukraine reported small clusters of ergot poisoning, mostly among impoverished rural groups. Though not widespread, these outbreaks served as reminders that ergot was never truly defeated, only managed. While agriculture continued to combat the fungus, medical science expanded its exploration of ergot derivatives. Researchers investigated their potential role in treating Parkinson's disease, circulatory disorders, and hormonal imbalances. Drugs like bromocriptine, derived from ergot compounds, offered new lines of therapy for conditions that once had few options. Physicians across Europe and the United States prescribed these medications carefully, aware of their potency. Ergot had become a paradox, both a savior and a threat, a source of hope and a reminder of past suffering. Modern public health systems also evolved in response to ergot's long history. Governments introduced surveillance programs to detect contamination early. Laboratories developed sensitive tests to measure alkaloid levels in grain. International organizations such as the FAO and who issued guidelines for safe levels of ergot in food supplies, these policies reflected centuries of hard-earned knowledge, transforming lessons from medieval tragedies into modern protection. But even as safety improved, ergot continued to influence global consciousness in subtle ways. Its hallucinations, once interpreted as visions of saints, demons, or curses, became metaphors in literature and psychology. Writers described ergotism as a doorway between worlds, a reminder of how fragile perception can be. Historians revisited ancient and medieval accounts, reassessing events once attributed to sorcery or mass hysteria. Scholars debated whether ergot influenced episodes like the St. Anthony's fire outbreaks, the Strasbourg dancing plague of 1518, or even the spiritual experiences at Elicit. Case studies across continents demonstrated ergot's enduring presence. In South America, researchers identified ergot infections in Andean barley fields in the 1980s, though few cases of poisoning occurred thanks to modern awareness. In Canada, agricultural scientists studied ergot in prairie rye grasses, mapping how climate patterns affected fungal growth. In Australia, outbreaks appeared in cattle rather than humans, as grazing animals consumed contaminated pasture grasses. Farmers reported livestock staggering, trembling, and losing extremity symptoms eerily familiar to medieval European doctors. Globalization also reshaped ergot's impact. International grain trade meant that a contaminated harvest in one country could spread across borders within weeks. Governments invested in quality testing and fumigation systems to prevent contaminated shipments. Yet, the challenges of climate variability, floods, droughts, shifting temperatures, introduced new uncertainties. Scientists warned that changing weather patterns might create conditions where ergot could flourish once again. By the late 1990s, humanity had a deeper understanding of ergot than ever before. We recognized its chemical intricacies, its medical potential, its cultural influence, and its devastating history. But we also understood that ergot was not an artifact of the past. It was a living organism, adaptable and persistent. Across the world, from modern laboratories to rural fields, ergot remained a quiet teacher, reminding us of the inseparable link between agriculture, health, and society. Its story was no longer about outbreaks alone, but about resilience, adaptation, and the complex balance between nature and human ingenuity. The modern age had reshaped ergot's place in the world, but its legacy still lingered in our food systems, our medicine, and our collective memory. And as we prepare to step into the contemporary period, the story narrows its focus. Because even today, in an era of global surveillance and advanced science, we still grapple with the legacy of the fungus that once fueled madness. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of ergot. Even in a world connected by satellites, digital mapping, global trade networks, and instantaneous communication, a fungus that first evolved on prehistoric grasses continues to influence medicine, agriculture, public health, and human psychology. Ergot has not disappeared. It has simply shifted into new forms, new concerns, and new scientific frontiers. Our story enters the 21st century with enormous strides in agricultural safety. Throughout Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, grain fields are monitored with precision tools, satellite imaging, drone surveys, soil sensors. Farmers can detect fungal growth earlier than any generation before them. Yet ergot remains stubborn. Climate variability, warmer springs, wetter summers, unseasonal rains creates unpredictable outbreaks. In some countries, especially across northern Europe and the Canadian prairies, ergot contamination in rye and barley has increased in certain years. These spikes serve as reminders that even modern systems cannot fully control natural cycles. Contemporary statistics reveal the complexity of the challenge. The European Food Safety Authority reports that ergot contamination is detected in roughly 0.1% to 1% of grain samples annually, depending on region and weather patterns. While most contaminated batches are caught and destroyed, a few slip through, especially in low-income supply chains. In parts of Central Asia and East Africa, ergot remains a recurring issue. Limited storage infrastructure, inconsistent regulation, and economic strain create conditions similar to those that fueled outbreaks centuries ago. Public health agencies remain vigilant. In 2009, Kazakhstan reported a cluster of ergot poisoning cases in rural villages where rye was stored in damp, unventilated barns. Victims exhibited convulsions, headaches, and burning sensations in their limbs. The outbreak was quickly contained, but it sparked renewed international collaboration on fungal surveillance. In 2012, researchers in Ethiopia documented seasonal contamination in barley fields at high altitudes, prompting new education campaigns for farmers. These programs emphasized early recognition of ergot sclerotia and proper grain handling techniques. As food systems globalize, countries must balance production, safety, and cost efficiency. International trade agreements now include strict maximum permissible levels for ergot alkaloids. Shipments exceeding those limits are rejected at ports. This prevents major outbreaks but also strains economies that rely heavily on grain exports. As a result, ergot sits at the intersection of biology and geopolitics, influencing regulations, market prices, and diplomatic tensions. Meanwhile, ergot's role in modern medicine has expanded into new territory. Advanced pharmaceuticals derived from its compounds continue to treat migraines, manage postpartum bleeding, and support therapies for Parkinson's disease. Researchers experiment with modified alkaloids to explore treatments for psychiatric conditions, hormone disorders, and vascular diseases. The fungus that once crippled villages now provides essential components for medicines used in hospitals around the world. The legacy of LSD derived from ergot's molecular structure persists as well. After decades of prohibition, psychedelic research has entered a renaissance. Universities in the United States, Europe, and Canada conduct clinical trials exploring LSD-assisted therapy for depression, end-of life, anxiety, PTSD, and addiction. Early results show potential benefits, sparking philosophical discussions about consciousness, trauma, and the therapeutic power of altered perception. In a twist unimaginable to medieval farmers, the same fungus that once inspired visions of angels or demons now appears in peer-reviewed journals as part of modern psychotherapy. Still, controversy surrounds psychedelics. Regulatory frameworks vary widely across nations. Some permit controlled research, others maintain strict bans. Public debate continues, echoing older tensions between fear and curiosity, danger and potential. Even beyond medicine, ergot has become a subject of fascination for historians, ecologists, anthropologists, and climate scientists. Studies suggest that shifting climatic patterns may alter the prevalence of ergot infections in the decades to come. Warmer winters could expand the fungus's range. Unpredictable rainfall might create new hotspots in regions once considered safe. This has renewed interest in breeding more resistant grain varieties. Modern laboratories now sequence the genome of ergot species to better understand their evolution and toxin production. This research offers more than agricultural protection. It provides insight into how organisms adapt, survive, and exploit ecological niches. Ergot's story becomes a lens for understanding resilience, mutation, and the delicate balance between life forms sharing the same environment. Culturally, ergot holds a place in contemporary imagination. Writers revisit its medieval horrors. Filmmakers reference its hallucinatory legends. Historians re-examine episodes like the Salem witch trials, exploring how ergotism may have influenced the psychological landscape of early American colonies. Debates continue in academic circles, not because we lack answers, but because the relationship between human belief, illness, and environment is far more intricate than once imagined. In the past 2 decades, several countries have introduced more stringent monitoring systems. Machine learning algorithms now analyze vast datasets of soil composition, humidity, and crop health to predict where ergot might emerge. Farmers receive alerts on their phones. Grain distributors rely on automated detection technologies that examine thousands of kernels per minute. These innovations embody a truth, centuries in the making. Humanity has learned to coexist with ergot, rather than fear it blindly. Yet despite all technological progress, ergot persists where inequality persists. In remote villages dependent on subsistence farming, in communities without stable grain storage, in households where contaminated bread is not discarded but eaten out of necessity. The fungus endures not because it is powerful, but because the conditions that support it remain unevenly distributed across the globe. Ergotism today is rare, but it is not forgotten. Its presence in the margins of society reminds us of the fragile line between nourishment and danger, between health and illness, between scientific triumph and human vulnerability. And so, as we stand in the present day, surrounded by digital tools, scientific breakthroughs, and global networks, we still live with the legacy of ergot. A legacy written in ancient rituals, medieval hospitals, Renaissance laboratories, and modern clinics. A legacy that stretches across continents and centuries. In the quiet of this final moment, we step back from the long arc of history and look at ergot, not as a monster or a miracle, but as a reminder one carried through thousands of years of human experience. For as long as we have grown grain, this fungus has lived beside us, shaping our world in ways we rarely notice. It has caused suffering and inspired discovery. It has torn apart families and given rise to medicines that save lives. It has stirred fear, faith, creativity, and scientific curiosity. When we trace its path across continents and centuries, we see more than a fungus. We see a reflection of ourselves, our resilience, our vulnerability, our determination to understand the forces that influence our lives. From prehistoric hunters gathering wild grasses to medieval farmers praying over cursed fields, to modern scientists decoding DNA strands, Every generation has met ERGOT with a mixture of confusion, fear, and eventual insight. Tonight, as we let the story settle, we recognize something deeper. History is shaped not only by empires, wars, and ideas, but also by the smallest forms of life creatures, so small they can hide inside a grain of rye. ERGOT reminds us that human civilization is built on delicate foundations shaped by environment, weather, microorganisms, and the choices we make as a species. It teaches us that knowledge evolves slowly, and that every crisis contains the seeds of future understanding. And so our journey comes to a gentle close. The fields of ancient Mesopotamia grow quiet again. The medieval hospitals dim their lanterns. The laboratories of the modern era turn off their lights. What remains is the slow, steady rhythm of a world always learning, always adapting, always moving forward. May this story accompany you as you drift toward rest. May its long threads weave softly into your dreams. And may you feel, in this quiet moment, the calm that comes from understanding the past a little more deeply. The story continues, but for now, good night.